Good evening and a very warm welcome, everyone, for this last in a series of 4 lectures. Well, the resource speaker today is an eminent personality. He has had an illustrious career as a lawyer, spending over 25 years at the Goan Bar, and he's had a very robust and a flourishing practice in different areas of law. Today, he is amongst the most respected and revered judges of the Bombay High Court. Uh, According to me, he is a fountain of knowledge and an articulate speaker. So, without any further ado, we are privileged to have Honorable Justice Sonak to deliver the last lecture in the series on the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, which, according to me, is a subject that every person who is in any way linked to the Indian judicial system should be aware of. So, sir, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Shivan. Thank you for your kind words, and I will really try my best to deserve them. As yet, I don't think I do deserve them, but thank you very much. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Your Goa Law Collective venture is indeed laudable. Now, constitutionalism is the idea often associated with the political theories of John Locke and other founding fathers of the American Republic. Constitutionalism is the idea that a government should be limited in its powers and its authority and even legitimacy depends upon its observations of these limitations. The core of constitutionalism is the belief that individuals have certain basic minimum rights like the right to life, the right to personal liberty, equality. And these rights are natural, they are inherent, they are inalienable. These rights are not the gift of the Constitution or they are not the gift of the state. These rights, in fact, predate even most of the written constitutions world over. Unfortunately, in the infamous case of ADM Jabalpur, our Supreme Court virtually held that since the fundamental rights contained in our Constitution are the gifts of our Constitution, they can as well be taken away by the Constitution if the situation so arises. Fortunately, the 9-judge bench in Puttaswamy set right the legal position, and Justice D.Y. Chandrachud penned these memorable words, and I quote, "Life and personal liberty are inalienable to human existence. When histories of nations are written and critiqued, there are judicial decisions at the forefront of liberty. Yet others have to be consigned to the archives, reflective of what was, but should never have been. ADM Jabalpur must be and is accordingly overruled." Now, friends, the anxiety of most of the democracies world over is to ensure that these basic minimum rights of the individuals are well entrenched. They are kept beyond the vicissitudes of political majorities. The general idea is to ensure that at least these basic minimum rights are not made subject to the outcome of some elections. However, democracies world over also recognize that these rights, howsoever lofty or ideal they may be, cannot be exercised in an absolute, unlimited, or an unbridled manner. These rights have to be limited to a reasonable extent by the collective interests of the society in which the individual lives. As is often said, that I have a right to swing my arm as I please. But in doing so, I have no right to hurt someone else's nose. This means that an individual's rights end where another individual's rights begin. To ensure this, there is necessity of some sort of an order. There is necessity of some sort of an enforcement agency or an organized government, as you would say. Only then can individuals exercise these basic rights or enjoy these liberties in an orderly manner. in the absence of any organized government, there is danger that might would always be right, and this would lead to chaos and anarchy. It was Theodore Roosevelt who very elegantly observed that order without liberty and liberty without order are both mutually destructive. But what happens when the governments or the organized governments become too powerful and themselves pose a threat to these basic rights of individuals? Sometimes there are situations where governments become absolutely dictatorial, become absolutely absolutist, so to say. History is in fact replete with examples of how powerful, though extremely well-meaning governments turned dictatorial and trampled upon the basic minimum rights of individuals. So therefore, experience has shown that we have to have legal documents which will limit the powers of the governments. It has been explained so nicely by as law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts. Now this is where the constitution comes in. The constitution in a democratic setup not only defines the legal relationship between various branches of the government, like the legislature, executive, are to be found in part 3, the chapter on fundamental rights. These fundamental rights, as you know, are basically injunctions against the state as is defined under Article 12. Now, what is really important for the purposes of today's presentation is Article 13 of the Constitution. As you know, Article 13 of the Constitution defines what is law, and most importantly, it says that any laws which were in force when the Constitution entered into force, or any laws which were prevalent when the Constitution entered into force, will become unconstitutional, or will become null, or will become ultra vires in case these laws conflict with the provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution. Article 3 also says that hereafter, no parliament or no state legislature will frame any laws which conflict with the fundamental rights contained in Part 3 of the Constitution. Now, it is said that it is under Article 13 that the courts like the Supreme Court and the High Court source their power to judicially review legislation. It is under these articles that the courts derive their power to declare or strike down legislations as ultra vires or unconstitutional. Some scholars even say that but for Article 13, there might not have been any power of judicial review of legislation vested in our courts. But frankly speaking, I am not too sure whether I subscribe to that position. At least the US Supreme Court, in the absence of any article similar to Article 13, did not find itself handicapped to review the legislation, thanks perhaps to the legal genius of Chief Justice John Marshall in the famous case of Marbury versus Madison. Now, this John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court for a period of almost 34 years. And look at his reasoning in Marbury versus Madison, whereby the Supreme Court usurped to itself the power of judicial review of legislation. His reasoning was really simple, but it was timeless. Now, he said that in a democracy, the power and sovereignty, true power and sovereignty, vests with the people. We the people. We the people are the authors who have given to themselves the Constitution. Now, the branches of the government, like the legislature, executive, or the judiciary, are nothing but the delegates of we the people. The real sovereignty, as I said, vests in the people. Now, if there is any conflict between the law made by a legislature, which is nothing but the delegate of we the people, and the law which is made by the sovereign, that is we the people, by which they mean the Constitution of the United States, then he reasoned that it is very, very obvious that the law made by we the people will prevail over the law made by the delegate. So by this he said that, and then he went further and he said that we the people, by enacting the constitution, have given the powers to the judicial branch to determine whether there is any conflict or not. And by these principles he said that it is very, very obvious that the Supreme Court has the power to judicially review legislations made by the Congress. And if they are unconstitutional, then we will as well strike them down. Now, the next important issue in constitutional law is whether the constitution, howsoever sacrosanct it may be, should be an edict in stone. Should it be unalterable, unchangeable, untrammeled for all times to come? Should the will, or I should say the wisdom of a past generation, be foisted upon the succeeding generations? Look what Thomas Jefferson had to say. He says that we may consider each generation as a distinct nation with a right by will of its majority to bind themselves, but none to bind the succeeding generation any more than the inhabitants of another country. Burke, another eminent statesman, said that a state without means of change is a state without means of its own conservation. So a constitution, which was perhaps excellent when it was originally enacted, may turn out to be outdated or even oppressive as the time marches by. The law, especially constitutional law, has to keep pace with the changing times and the felt necessities of the changing times. The law cannot afford to stand still as the world goes by, because then that would be disastrous for both. Even our founding fathers, who I should say were not mere politicians, but they were statesmen, realized that rigidity and brittleness might result in the breakdown of the constitutional and the constitutional functioning. And therefore they opted for resilience and flexibility. By way of a safety wall, they provided Article 368 in our constitution. Now this article enables the parliament to amend the constitution. The founding fathers in fact tried to strike a balance. The procedure for amendment was not made extremely difficult, nor was it made extremely easy so as to be reduced into a plaything in the hands of the politicians. Broadly, an amendment can be brought about in three ways. There are certain provisions in the constitution which require only a simple majority in the parliament. Then there are some provisions in the constitution which require a simple majority plus a two-third majority in the parliament. That means there should be at any given point of time more than 50% of the members present in the house, and then there has to be a two-third majority. And for certain other provisions which are extremely vital, which concern the states, which concern judicial review, like Article 226, now an amendment can be brought about by a special majority plus ratification by 1/2 of the states. That it is called as a special majority. Now, at least in theory, if you look at the text of Article 368, as long as the government of the day enjoys support of two-thirds of the members of the parliament and 1/2 of the state legislatures, its powers to amend the constitution is virtually unlimited and untrammeled. Now, friends, please see the paradox which arises in a piquant situation of this kind. We have seen that on one hand, the constitution places the fundamental rights in part 3 on an extremely high pedestal by saying that any law made by the parliament or the state legislatures is void if it conflicts with any of the provisions of part 3. On the other hand, the same constitution says that the parliament can amend any provisions of the constitution, which will obviously include part 3 of the constitution as well. Now, what does this paradox mean? By resort to Article 368, can the government, which enjoys a brute majority, amend the constitution as it pleases? Are there no limitations, no implied limitations when it comes to amendment of the constitution? Can it, for example, abolish the Supreme Court and the High Court and consequently the institution of judiciary itself? Can it do away with the democratic form of government and opt for a, say, dictatorship or monarchy? Can it, by a constitutional amendment, extend the term from the present 5 years to say 20 years, 25 years, or 35 years? Can it take away the fundamental right to life, liberty, equality? At least upon a plain reading of Article 368, it cannot be said that the Parliament cannot. Therefore, the moot question is whether the power of the Parliament in such matters is absolute, limitless, unfettered. Now, these were some of the seminal questions which came up for consideration in the famous case of Keshavananda Bharati. Now, before we go to this case, some prelude is necessary. See, soon after independence, there was a flurry of various legislations brought about by the parliament as well as the state legislatures, which were popularly referred to as the agrarian reform legislations, similar to the Land to the Tiller Act which we have in Goa, or certain other legislations in order to promote agriculture, which was sort of accepted as being the true culture of our nation. Now, at that time, we had Article 19(1)(f), which guaranteed the right to property, which was again a fundamental right because it was in Article 19 itself. Now, these legislations were challenged all over the country, and the Patna High Court, the full bench of the Patna High Court in the case of Kameshwar Singh versus State of Bihar, struck down one such legislation, saying that such a legislation is in conflict with the right to property. It is inconsistent with the property rights which are guaranteed by the Constitution, and therefore, following Article 13, such a law cannot exist. Such a law will have to be declared as null and void, and accordingly they struck it down. Now, soon after this happened, in fact, 2 other high courts in the country had upheld such laws also. But the parliament, in fact, at that time, the Constituent Assembly was itself functioning as the parliament. But the parliament was quite jittery about what happened in Patna, and they mooted the first amendment to our constitution. Now, what did they do? Article 31 also dealt with fundamental right to property. So they first introduced Article 31A, and they said that any law in furtherance of an agrarian reform will be immune from challenge on the ground that it violates Articles 14, 19 and 31 of the Constitution. They did not stop here. They also included Article 31B, and by that they introduced what is known as the 9th schedule to our Constitution. And they said that even if a law is struck down by any court, the moment we lift that law and place it in the 9th schedule, it will revive. And they said that any laws which are placed in the 9th schedule, whether struck down by any court or otherwise, will have absolute immunity from the challenge that they in fact violate the provisions of Articles 14, 19 and 31 of the Constitution of India. This was nothing but diluting the fundamental rights contained in Articles 14, 19 and 31 of the Constitution of India. It was saying that these articles are powerless when dealing with an agrarian reform. Now, this first amendment was challenged before the Supreme Court in 2 cases. First, it was challenged in 1952 itself in the case of Shankari Prasad versus Union of India. And thereafter, this issue was revisited in Sajjan Singh versus State of Rajasthan. Now, the argument of the petitioners was, we have seen Article 13. Article 13 says that any law which conflicts with Part 3 is unconstitutional. The petitioners argued that the law to amend the Constitution is also law for purposes of Article 13. And therefore, if such a law interferes with any of the fundamental rights, then such a law itself is unconstitutional. That was the argument. But this argument was rejected by the Supreme Court in Shankari Prasad. And the Supreme Court said that there is a difference between ordinary law or law which is enacted in exercise of ordinary legislative power and law which is enacted in exercise of constituent power. So they said that when the parliament amends the constitution, it is exercising what is known as constituent power, and therefore that law is not law for purposes of Article 13. This view was reiterated also in Sajjan Singh, but this time Justice Hidayatullah and Justice Mudolkar expressed a dissent, and they said that we are not too sure whether Shankari Prasad principle is right and the powers of the parliament to amend the constitution are absolute. The issue came up directly for consideration in the case of Golaknath versus State of Punjab. And here, by a razor-thin majority of 6:5, Shankari Prasad and Sajjan Singh were overruled. The Supreme Court said that there can be no distinction between legislative and constituent power. And they said that a constitutional amendment is also law under Article 13, and therefore the Parliament cannot amend Part 3, or they cannot in fact touch the chapter on fundamental rights. This was the position in Golaknath. Now the Parliament hit back, and hit back rather badly. The Parliament in the first place brought about the 24th Amendment Act of 1971, by which they amended Article 13 itself. They introduced 13(4) to say that Article 13 will not apply to any law for amending the Constitution. They perhaps did not trust the courts, so therefore they amended Article 368 also. And they said that any amendment under Article 368 is not law for purposes of Article 13. Very, very clear. Then they brought about a 25th Amendment by which they enacted and added Article 31C to the Constitution. Now, what did Article 31C do? Article 31C gave an absolute precedence to all the directive principles over the fundamental rights. In fact, in Keshavananda Bharati, Alkiwala opened his arguments by saying that the 25th Amendment actually turns the Constitution on its head, because directive principles of state policy which were not meant to be enforceable have been given a precedence, and fundamental rights which were meant to be enforceable have been made subservient to the directive principles. And then the 29th Amendment, several land reform laws were included in the 9th schedule. Now, this 24th, 25th and 29th Amendments were challenged in Keshavananda Bharati. And the arguments of the petitioners in Keshavananda Bharati were that there is no distinction between constituent power and legislative power. They said that we the people had given only limited rights to the Parliament. Parliament was the donee of limited rights, and such a donee cannot convert itself to having unlimited rights. They said that Article 368 is not some charter to sign the death wish of the Constitution. In fact, if the argument is taken too further, they said that what prevents the Parliament from saying that we are now repealing the Constitution itself? Then they said that the Parliament is not the official liquidator of the Constitution. Parliament is only a creature of the Constitution. The arguments went on for almost 5 months, and ultimately the judgment was passed. It was 11 separate opinions, 800 pages and 420,000 words. 6 judges held that the Parliament has unlimited amending power. Yet another 6 judges held that the Parliament has only limited amending power. It was Justice H.R. Khanna who said that Parliament's powers when it comes to amendment of the Constitution are supreme, but they are not supreme enough, which means that the Parliament, if it chooses, can also amend the chapter on fundamental rights, but the Parliament cannot go as far as to destroy or abrogate what he called as the basic structure of the Constitution. He went further and he said that it is ultimately for the judiciary to decide what constitutes the basic structure. He said that we cannot give a cut and dry test as to what is the basic structure. As and when the time comes, it is for us to decide what is the basic structure. It is said that this judgment contributed to the survival of democracy in India. And he gave instances, several judges, the 6 or the 7 judges gave instances of what is the basic structure, like the supremacy of the Constitution, free and fair elections, independent judiciary, and so on. Now, one of the criticisms against this judgment is that it is an outstanding study in the lack of consensus. It is too long, too confusing. There is no such word as basic structure in the constitution. So therefore, what is this basic structure was left to the whims and the variable judicial perceptions. It was said that this judgment is a classic example of judicial overreach, that this judgment was counter-majoritarian because ultimately the will of the people is expressed in the parliament or in the state legislatures. Why should the court have the right to determine whether something is contrary to basic structure when in fact there is no such concept which can be even read into the constitution? The contribution of Bombay High Court a lot. Nani Palkhiwala argued for the petitioners. Sirvai appeared for the state of Kerala, but he really took on Nani Palkhiwala. If you permit me, I can tell you an interesting anecdote. When Nani Palkhiwala opened his arguments on the first day, at the end of the day, there were so many questions coming from the bench of 13 judges that he was absolutely exhausted and he could not make any much headway. So at the end of the day, he just sat down and he said that tomorrow I don't think I'll be able to argue this matter. I cannot cope up with this. And who was present over there was yet another eminent lawyer from Bombay, C.K. Daftari. And he said, Nani, don't worry. Tomorrow I will ensure that you have a quiet court. And everybody was surprised as to how can Daftari ensure a quiet court. But Daftari went to see Chief Justice Sikri in his chambers. And Justice Sikri was all honey and sugar. He said, what do we owe your coming here? And Daftari said, Chief Justice, a friend of mine has come along with his little daughter, and the little daughter wanted to see the Supreme Court. She is absolutely impressed with the Supreme Court. She's impressed with the decor, and she's most impressed with the 13 eminent judges, how well dressed they are and how wonderful they look. But at the end of it, the girl asked her father, please tell me, who is that one man who is standing in front of all these 13 judges and trying to interrupt those judges from time to time? Why is he behaving in this kind of a manner? And Justice Sikri said, Mr. Daftari, point well made. We will see to it that tomorrow Mr. Palkhiwala is not interrupted. Let him go ahead with his arguments. Now, the decision was delivered on 24th of April 1973 because on the next day, Justice Sikri was due to retire. On the next day, there was supersession of the three senior-most judges and Chief Justice A.N. Ray, who had in fact held that the Parliament's powers to amend the Constitution are unlimited, was made the Chief Justice. Soon thereafter, on 12th of June, the Allahabad High Court unseated Mrs. Gandhi, who was then our Prime Minister. She moved the Supreme Court during vacations and the matter was taken up by Justice Krishna Iyer, who only granted a conditional stay. On the midnight of 24th and 25th of June 1975, emergency was imposed in this country and there was an absolute censorship which was imposed. I would show you a slide of one of the advertisements which appeared in the Times of India on 26th of June. If you can read it in details, it says that Deo Crazy, beloved husband of T. Ruth, which means truth, loving father of Eli Bertie, which means liberty, brother of faith, hope and justicia, expired on June 26th. This means that the censors thought that it was some kind of an obituary notice and that is the way it passed the muster of the censors. But coming back to the aftermath, after emergency was imposed, on 10th of August 1975, we have the 39th Amendment to the Constitution. What did this 39th Amendment do? This 39th Amendment virtually put the election of the President, Vice President, Prime Minister and Speaker immune from judicial review. They said that such an election, even if it has been struck down by a High Court, will have to be now redecided by the Supreme Court on the basis of a law which was yet to be enacted. In effect, they made retrospective amendments to election laws. Then there was a 41st Amendment which was introduced, which gave civil and criminal immunity to presidents, vice president, governors, and prime ministers forever. That means even if you were a governor for one day, you had absolute civil and criminal immunity for the rest of your life. On 10th of November 1975, a bench was constituted by Chief Justice A.N. Ray to review Keshavananda Bharati. And for 2 days, it is said that the manner in which Mr. Palkhiwala argued, the Chief Justice was almost constrained to dissolve the bench because there was an embarrassing issue as to who had asked for a review. Finally, 42nd Amendment was introduced in the Parliament, and this 42nd Amendment amended Article 368 itself so as to legislatively overrule the decision in Keshavananda Bharati's case. Articles 368, 4 and 5 clearly say that the Parliament has unlimited amending powers, and there is nothing like a basic structure doctrine, or there can be no limitations when it comes to the Parliament's power to amend the Constitution. Finally, emergency was lifted, elections were held. I must say that in the case of Rajnarayan versus Indira Gandhi, where that 39th Amendment was challenged, 5-judge bench, which was headed by Chief Justice A.N. Ray, in fact, 4 of the judges rose to the occasion, and they said that we are bound by the ruling in Keshavananda Bharati case, and on that basis they struck down the 39th Amendment as being violative of the basic structure. All the judges gave different reasons. One judge said that this was contrary to the rule of law. Other judge said it was contrary to the principle of equality. The third judge said that this was contrary to the doctrines of Rohinton Nariman. And the argument was that the limited, now this was basically a challenge to Articles 364, 4 and 5. And the argument was that limited amending power is itself the basic structure of the Constitution. And if so, by conferring unlimited amending power to the Parliament, there has been a breach of the basic structure. And this was accepted by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that any attempt by the Parliament to have unlimited amending power itself amounts to a violation of the basic structure of the Constitution, and therefore such an amendment is required to be struck down. Then in I.R. Coelho's case also they held that there is nothing like directive principles are superior or fundamental rights are superior. Both constitute the arc of the Constitution. They said that Articles 14, 19 and 21 constitute the golden triangle of the Constitution, and besides, these articles constitute the basic structure. They also said that the 9th schedule is not some kind of a black hole in the Constitution of India. Now, friends, I have reached my time. I will only conclude by saying that the Supreme Court decision in Keshavananda Bharati and the basic structure doctrine evolved therein secured or saved the Indian democracy. This is truly a tribute to lawyers and judges and the institution of judiciary itself, which naturally encompasses both. But permit me to conclude by quoting learned Hand, who years ago said, and I quote, "I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon the Constitution, upon the laws, and upon the courts. These are false hopes. Believe me, these are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no courts can save it. No constitution, no law, no courts can even do much to help it. The price of liberty, according to me, is eternal vigilance. The very holding of this webinar is an indication that even amidst this crisis of severe proportions, you all are vigilant. And I really applaud you and thank you for all this. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the organizers and all of you present here today, I express my heartfelt thanks to Honorable Justice Sonak for agreeing to be our guest speaker today. Thank you, sir, for sharing with us your words of wisdom. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you all participants for joining this particular lecture as well as other lectures in the series and making this lecture series a grand success. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you.